Oh, hello, come in. Hi. Standing kind of in a great cascade of books and papers that I'm still dealing with, but I'm looking at the... You may remember I was telling you this is where I keep the slim volumes of modern poetry. Though in fact, as you can see, it's actually overflowing and falling out both ways, and lots more of the slim volumes are sort of sideways here. I'm still trying to organise them. Gradually we're taking books to the new house, but of course I'll have no sooner taken one there than I feel I can't do without it, so I linger over them. So I was looking at my volumes here of John Heath Stubbs. He was a very remarkable modern poet. For some reason there's a photo of Tolkien in this one. He was based in Oxford. He was a blind poet, but he's got a very nice style. Do have a seat. Anyway, I was reading one of the poems in this volume, which is called Sweet Apple Earth. Lovely title. Carcanet. It's full of accounts of different figures and writers and moments that happened to them. On the back it says here, a light Augustan breeze riffled through the leaves of an apple tree in a walled garden at Kensington, a village not far from London. Isaac Newton sat in the latest summer sun. Diamond, his dog, was at his feet and snapped at flies. And you know it's going to be a poem about the falling of the apple. Anyway, I was reading through these poems again, and I happened to come across, for some reason bookmark it with a postcard of Tolkien, I happened to come across a poem about George Macdonald, which is simply called George Macdonald 1824 to 1905, and those are indeed the dates of George Macdonald, and we'll be coming up to the 200th anniversary of his birth in a couple of years. Well, my eyes lit up because I love George Macdonald, but also because I've sort of suddenly found myself in a moment of inadvertence. I became president of the George Macdonald Society. Of course, it's a great honour, but whether I'll be able to do all the things that ought to be done with it, I don't know. But anyway, I take what opportunities I can to share my love of Macdonald. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'd forgotten that John Heath Stubbs had written a poem about George Macdonald. And the poem is wonderful because it evokes the marvellous beginnings and many of the most marvellous moments in Macdonald's books, but particularly in his fantasy books. Macdonald is really the founder, the kind of great-grandfather of fantastical writing. He's the person who inspires both Tolkien and Lewis and Charles Williams and others. And his books are still eminently readable and deeply transformative, I think, numinous. Anyway, let me read you the poem and see if it intrigues you. If you already know Macdonald, some of this will ring bells, but I'll read you the poem and then we might just dip into a bit of Macdonald himself. So, George Macdonald, 1824 to 1905, by John Heath Stubbs. When the water in the basin overflows, becoming a stream that runs through a wood. When the flowers on the carpet are turned into real blossoms, and the trees are human, some seductresses and dangerous, some maternal and protective. When you sleep in an arbour observed by the bright eyes of birds, till at midnight they come without faces, the dancers, those who in life wore masks, and now are condemned to be featureless. When a book in the library is partly here in our world, and partly in another. When the librarian's ghost is a raven, is Adam. When innocence is under threat from goblin troglodytes, from corrupt courts, from hunting white panthers. Maternal presences are concealed in secret drawers in unvisited turrets and at the back of the north wind, when a fire of roses purges perception, and you hold among those images an unbroken thread, and goodness is ordinary as having your breakfast, as being fed a spoonful of porridge by a woman both old and young. She is that wisdom Boethius knew, and Hermas. So he evokes a series of moments. I mean, the beginning of the novel Fantastes, it is true that the water basin runs over and becomes a stream, and the flowery pattern on the carpet becomes flowers, and the hero of Fantastes discovers that part of his house and his room is also in a parallel, as it were, in the other dimensional world, is part of fairyland, and there's a certain point where the two overlap, and he finds himself in these enchanted woods, and meets indeed these trees who are partly people, partly trees. And then, so that's the transition into the other realm, the other world in Fantastes. And then the next bit in this poem is about the book Lilith, and this is the one that I think particularly attracted me for our meetings and a spell in the library, because you could argue that Lilith begins almost quite literally with a spell in the library. The way Heath Stubbs puts it here, he says, when a book in the library is partly here in our world and part in another, when the librarian's ghost is a raven, is Adam. So this is a reference to the wonderful opening of this book, Lilith. I rather like this cover, actually. It's got the magical mirror picture you can get into, and Mr. Raven. Anyway, this book, the opening chapter of Lilith is called The Library, and it starts with a young man who's just inherited in his estate, the rambling old house that belonged to his family, which he has still to explore. It's where Lewis gets his idea of beautiful big old houses with many stairs and passages and secret doors and wardrobes. All comes really out of almost this opening chapter. So there's a very beautiful account of the library. It had contained a fine library whose growth began before the invention of printing and had continued to my own time. And then I love this. That's about that. This is very true. Of course, you come here to this library, and this is just one room in the house. But I mean, we could explore this whole house, and you'd find that all the books that are full here and on the floors and in piles have, in fact, of course, overflowed like a kind of running stream into the other bits of the house. And he says just that here. The library, though duly considered in many alterations of the house and additions to it, had nevertheless, like an encroaching state, absorbed one room after another until it occupied the greater part of the ground floor. That's very true. Its chief room was large, and the walls of it were covered with books, almost to the ceiling. The rooms into which it overflowed were of various sizes and shapes, and communicated in modes as various, by doors, by open arches, by short passages, by steps up and steps down. What it would be to have a library like that. Anyway, along the shelves of the library, there's a shelf which looks like it's got books, like all the other shelves, but actually they're the backs of books. And there's a door, and you can open in, and you go into a little kind of wardrobe or cupboard in which there are other books, sort of like a secret chamber of books. And by a kind of illusion that it supposedly was just made by the workers, shelved above the top of this door of books is a book that's sort of half in and half out. And it's just supposed to be an illusion, and you can open the door and go in, and it would just be made to look as if it was coming half in, half out. And he knows it's a manuscript which has been cut in half, and the other half has been glued on somewhere. He knows all that. But then he keeps seeing this mysterious figure of a kind of dusky librarian in a kind of long black tail coat, and going in and out of this room which goes nowhere. And then one day he sees that the book, the wedged in book that's coming through, is gone. And of course, it turns out, that this really is a portal and a door. Anyway, he follows it. So that's one. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. A book which is half. I mean, that's the way. How did Heath Stubbs put it? When a book in the library is partly here in our world and partly in another. Well, every book is like that. Every really good book, especially every wonderful poetic fancy book, is partly in this world and partly another. Every book is a portal that draws you through from one world to another. I read you the other day the lovely moment of transition in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader when they look at the picture and the breeze from another world blows out of the picture, and pictures are like that too. So are mirrors. So in this book, a book is like that. But there's also a scene where he goes up into a long attic and into what is effectively a big wardrobe, and a big sort of enclosed room, and there's a mirror hanging in it. I'm sure this is where J.K. Rowling got the Mirror of Erised, a kind of mirror just by itself. And let me read you this, because this I think is we'll finish with this. This is one of the great moments of portal or transition from one world to another. So he follows up one winding stair after another, this ghostly librarian who's taken the book that's in both worlds. And then he comes up to an attic. He said, I was in the main garret with huge beams and rafters over my head, great spaces around me, a door here and there in sight, and long vistas whose gloom was thinned by a few lurking cobwebbed windows and small dusky skylights. I gazed with a strange mingling of awe and pleasure. The wide expanse of garret was my own and unexplored. In the middle of it stood an unpainted enclosure of rough planks, the door of which was ajar. Thinking Mr. Raven might be there, I pushed the door and entered. The small chamber was full of light, but such as dwells in places deserted. It had a dull, disconsolate look, as if it found itself of no use and regretted having come. A few rather dim sun rays marking their tracks through the cloud of motes that had just been stirred up, fell upon a tall mirror with a dusty face, old-fashioned and rather narrow in appearance, an ordinary glass. It had an ebony frame, at the top of which stood a black eagle with outstretched wings, in his beak a golden chain, from whose end hung a black ball. I had been looking at, rather than into, the mirror, when suddenly I became aware that it reflected neither the chamber nor my own person. I have an impression of having seen the wall melt away, but what followed is enough to account for any uncertainty. Could I have mistaken for a mirror the glass that protected a wonderful picture? I saw before me a wild country, broken and heathy. Desolate hills of no great height, but somehow of strange appearance, occupied the middle distance. Along the horizon stretched the tops of a far-off mountain range. Nearest me lay a tract of moorland, flat and melancholy. Being short-sighted, I stepped closer to examine the texture of a stone in the immediate foreground, and in the act espied, hopping towards me with solemnity, a large and ancient raven, whose purply black was here and there softened with grey. He seemed looking for worms as he came. Nowise astonished at the appearance of a live creature in a picture, I took another step forward to see him better, stumbled over something, doubtless the frame of the mirror, and stood nose to beak with the bird. I was in the open air, on a houseless heath. It's wonderful, he's just found himself in another world. And he wonders where he is, but then of course the raven speaks to him, and he realises that all these places in his house may be mysterious portals to another world, and he sets off to explore. But you can see how much Lewis has drawn in different ways in different books, right? From The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe through to The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, from this, but it's endlessly generative. I'm of course not accusing Lewis or Tolkien or anyone else of plagiarism. I mean, they do unique and beautiful and original things, but their imagination has been stirred, a possibility has been opened up, an image has been given. In some sense, this book has been, as it were, wedged between a magical world of Macdonald's and the world of, say, Lewis or Tolkien, and Macdonald's book has allowed them to move back and forth. But then Macdonald's book has itself become a key to open up new worlds. And that's the way the imagination works, and that's why poetry and myth-making are so wonderful. And that's why, in my own small way, I'm delighting to try my hand at it too as I write the Arthurian poems. Anyway, nice to see you, and thanks for dropping by.